Good afternoon and welcome to the second of our MFL webinars for British schools in the Middle East. My name is Claire Barclay-Juniman and I am the head of MFL at Park House English School in Doha, Qatar. So today's webinar is titled Increasing Students' Spoken Fluency in the Target Language. We are delighted to welcome our speaker today, Zoe Thorne, who is head of content at LanguageNut. Zoe works in the primary and secondary curricula at LanguageNut, and she has taught MFL and EFL in France, Germany and the UK. She is the co-author of a number of French and German IGCSE and A-level textbooks. Zoe is currently teaching herself Arabic. She will be discussing practical tips and ideas in helping students practice speaking in lessons when social distancing makes pair work, choral repetition, singing and face-to-face dialogues difficult. Please share your questions and comments in the chat bar. I will monitor these throughout the session and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar for both sets of speakers. Please remember that this webinar is recorded and it can be referred to at any point. Please do share it with your colleagues at school. Okay, thank you. Zoe, over to you.
Thanks very much, Claire. And thank you to BSME MFL Networks for having me. So first of all, I would really like to say to all the teachers and school staff who are here, in case no one has told you this, you are doing an amazing job. It's incredible what teachers have done. You've had to this year completely change your job at very short notice and you've risen to the challenge. And not only that, the fact that you are here doing a kind of CPD session in your own time or in your PPA time means that you're trying to not just survive but actually do even better, and I think that's incredible. So first of all, much respect to all of you. If I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. Thanks very much. So yeah, as Claire said, I am working for LanguageNut, although I'm a former French and German and EFL teacher as well. And what I'd like to be talking today is something which is already quite difficult at the best of times, which is trying to get students have really good speaking skills and increase their fluency in the target language. Yet on top of that, you then have a pandemic and all the extra challenges that comes with that. So what I want to do is to try to give you as many practical tips as possible. I want to give you ideas that you can use on Monday morning with your classes. And I will be there will be some examples from LanguageNut because we are a company where many people on our team are former teachers, and we've tried to design a product that does solve the problems that we had when we were teaching, but also there'll be plenty of other general activities as well and other resources. You'll see in the chat that, or in the Q&A, Claire has posted a link to a survey, and I would love it if you could respond to that at some point during this presentation or a little bit later. Jim, if I could have the next slides, please. If I could have the next slide, please, that'd be great. Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks very much. So as well as the link, there is a QR code as well if you want to use your phone to do that. And so here, these are some of the challenges the teachers that I've been speaking to of. These are what they've come up with. And these are the same options that are in the survey. So what I'd really like to know is which of these are challenges that you are facing. And because not everything will apply to everyone. So, for example, some schools are doing a mix of live and remote lessons. Some schools are doing just remote learning. In the UK, masks are not allowed in the classroom, but I know that in different regions in the Middle East they are. So there are different challenges here you might be facing. So I'd love it if you could let me know, first of all, which of these you're facing. The second question is, which of these is the biggest challenge when it comes to speaking? And thirdly, I'd like to know which languages you're teaching. Just, yeah, really helps us get an idea. So I'll let you do that in your own pace, at some point during the presentation, and I'll come back to the responses later so I can see as they're coming through. I'm not going to read all the challenges out. You can read them perfectly well. And we're teachers, we multitask, that's what we do. So but I'll just let you have a quick look through. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks very much. So, as I said, I want to give practical tips for combating these problems, and I divide them into 3 sections for different elements of teaching speaking. So these more or less correspond to the PPP if you use that model, but actually even if you don't use that model, teaching speaking generally will involve some form of presenting and practicing presenting and practicing the pronunciation. That's a tongue twister. Some kind of real structured practice to really sort of get that drilled in, and then some form of open speaking. So those are the 3 areas that I want to look at, and those are affected by those challenges in different ways. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So first of all, looking at pronunciation and phonics, what can you do? So one of the problems that we have is there are health risks associated with standing at the front of the class and bellowing and getting the students to repeat back. That might not be allowed anymore. So one thing you can do is using more audio and video clips instead of standing at the classroom and projecting. So you could either display those, play them on a smartboard if you're in the classroom, or if you're using PowerPoints or Google Classroom, those kind of things for remote learning. There are ways in which you can embed audios into those PowerPoints, for example. So if students are actually learning at home and they don't have you delivering that content, they can still do that. There are loads and loads of walkthroughs online of how you can do that. It's really, really simple to do. And then the question is, what can you do with that? So if we're not meant to be doing choral repetition anymore, or singing, which is something that I know that a lot of teachers really miss, there's no reason why you can't do some form of whispered repetition. So students can actually cover their mouths a little bit and whisper in the words that the chunks that you're presenting. And actually, although the unfortunate side of that is that you can't hear, you can't check, but it does mean actually sometimes that can give students a bit more confidence, particularly 14 and 15-year-olds, when they get to that age where they're a little bit self-conscious about doing choral repetition, and they don't want to try to do the tricky sounds, the r or the I in Arabic, because they don't want to look silly. But actually, if they're whispered, they might actually try it a little bit harder. And another game that you can do is with lip reading. So either you can mouth the word at the front of the classroom and students can try to guess what the word is, or you can do it as pair work. And this does still work with social distancing, with one student mouthing a word chunk from the list and then the other students trying to guess what that word is. And that can actually really help with them focusing on the mouth sounds. And this is quite hard on my disembodied voice at the moment. I know you can't see me. But if you imagine the kind of the U sounds in French or German, really looking at that mouth shape, which is actually so important. And I think you can get a lot more focus on that. There are loads of videos on YouTube and things where you can actually assign them homework so they can check those out to really practice those sounds at home. And the other thing you can do as homework is a kind of self-assessment using an online dictionary where they listen to the word and repeat at home. And this is one of the very, very few times where, if you don't mind me swearing, they can use Google Translate. There is actually a use of Google Translate, not the translation side of it, but it does have a really useful text-to-speech feature. So if you get them to copy and paste the word in, not translate, because it might translate it wrong, and most of the time it will. But for example, if you're teaching Arabic, and I apologize now for my pronunciation because I am still learning, but al-kitab, they could paste that in and they can click on that little speaker icon and they can have a text-to-speech rendition of it. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, and they can actually practice those sounds at home. Obviously, the downside is you can't check that. This is often going to be the case for things, but if you've got a motivated class, and at least they can really do well with that, and also it's providing them the opportunity to do that. So there are ways in which you can practice pronunciation without the kind of traditional choral repetition. If I could have the next slide, please, Jim. Thank you. We've also at LanguageNet tried to come up with some solutions as well. So we've embedded audio clips with native speakers for all the languages that we have. At secondary, we have French, German, Spanish, Arabic and English. We're adding Chinese very soon. We've got a bunch more at primary level as well. And so for all of them, they can listen to the clips and they can do various activities. And we have pronunciation games which use voice recognition software. I know that there are some other ones available online as well. This is the one that we have. And what we really like about this is that not only does it check whether what the student has said is correct or not, and For AI software, I think it's pretty good. I'm quite impressed with it. But it also gives feedback on what they said or how it interpreted it if they said it wrong. So, for example, if they're learning French, they're trying to do the colour rose, but they say rosa and they put too much on the E, then it will come back, as you can see, as rosa rather than rose. So that way they can actually get some instant feedback. And obviously the nice thing is that you as a teacher can see everything that they've done. You can check that they've done it. But as I said, there are a number of other voice recognition software things on the market. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the next thing is going down to structured practice and drilling. So it's kind of accepted, the pedagogy at the moment is that the only way to get fluency is to have automation. So they need to know this so well that they don't actually have to think about it, which is what we do in our native tongue, of course. You don't have to think about the words. So that's how we achieve fluency. And the only way to do that is lots and lots and lots and lots of practice. So the one challenge that we have, and I can see from the survey that lots of people are saying that time is a big issue. Because if you've had extensive lockdowns or the schools have been closed, it's been really, really difficult to get that precious lesson time. So lots of you may know this concept already of the flipped classroom, but in case you don't, the idea behind that is that instead of using the lesson time to introduce and practice vocabulary or chunks, the idea is that you set it beforehand so the students in theory come prepared, they know it, and then in the class they can then use, they're ready to use that vocabulary in those chunks, so they can actually practice really manipulating them. So if you are able to do that by giving them the things to practice, and they can have that pronunciation activities as well, that can really help them and save you some time. Another thing which is really popular at the moment is using sentence builders and making sure you're using chunks. So they're practicing over and over again, taking different sort of sections of a sentence, putting them together in different orders. So as much retrieval practice as possible. Sentence builders is something I would really recommend using. Again, I can see from the survey that lots of people are not allowed to use any kind of worksheets or anything like that, but there's no reason why you can't put sentence builders up on the board. You sometimes might have to change the way you lay them out, they can't be quite as full, but you can put them up on the board, or you can put them on whatever system you use, Google Classroom or whatever you use remotely. So using those. But then one question which comes up is, okay, what do we do with these sentence builders other than just straight translation? So one game which I really like is, we call it popcorn speaking. And this is something, it's an old game we used to play in the classroom, but now you can still do it on a video call. The way it works is, as a teacher, you say the first sentence, so you can choose a sentence using chunks from the sentence builder on whatever topic you're doing in the target language, and you select a student at random. That student stands up and they have to say, well, they have to do two things. That first of all, they have the choice, they can either just translate it into English, or they can repeat the sentence but change one aspect of it, so choose a different chunk somewhere. So instead of saying that they went to the cinema, they say that they went to the shops or something like that. And then they then say a new sentence, they choose another student, they sit down, the next student stands up and does the same thing. So that's why it's called popcorn, because the students are standing up and sitting down, and you can do that without moving around the classroom. But you can also do that on a video call as well. So much of what we're trying to do is find things that work both, because I know that some teachers, I can see from the survey that some teachers are doing these live and remote lessons at the same time. They've got half the class at home, they've got half the class in the classroom, which is pretty tough. But you can do this on a video call too. So instead of standing up, you just choose the next student and maybe they turn their camera on or something like that. So that's just quite a fun way of using the sentence builders. Another thing that you can use, again, for this really structured practice and this retrieval practice, is using what we call tense dialogues. Some of you might have come across this before. This is something I used a lot as a teacher, and the traditional way of doing it is with bits of paper. So the paper would be folded in half, or a piece of card folded in half, and you would have each side of the dialogue on either side of the piece of paper, so that person A can read person A's lines and the other one can read person B's lines. Obviously, if you can't share bits of paper. You're not allowed to use paper anymore. Then we have to find a way to make it digital. So what we can do is, I've got an example here in German. As I can see, we've got a mix of German, mostly French teachers, but we have some German. And you start off with the dialogue. This is a very, very simple one. For those of you who are not German speakers, this is about inviting someone to go out and saying, would you like to go to the cinema? Yes, I'm free on Saturday, and so on. So first of all, they start off reading it. Then you can see that some of the words underlined, and they then, as they get more confident, they can then change those things. So instead of saying, would you like to go to the cinema, möchtest du ins Kino gehen, they might say, möchtest du in die Stadt gehen, would you like to go into town instead? So they're using their knowledge to try and change it a little bit. And then something you can do with PowerPoint, or you can do with any sort of smartboard software, is you can start to put little ink blots over it. You can either just add little shapes that appear, or you can get your pen and start scribbling over it, so that as they keep practicing, they go round and round and round, and they have to do more and more of it from memory. So really getting that practice in, and they have to do more and more of it without scaffolding. And then finally, once they got really confident with that, you just give them the English or whatever language is the mother tongue in your classroom, and then they have to practice from that. So then, and finally, if they want to, they can even change the underlined words as well. So that little extension further. But it's that really structured practice which can allow them to achieve fluency, because I can assure you that after 20 minutes of doing this, they will know these chunks so well, and they will get more and more fluent, even when they're doing it from the English or nothing at all. So these are ways in which we can still do the kind of activities we used to do, but just slightly tweaked to do it in the kind of the COVID age, as we like to call it. Okay, and if I could have the next slide, please. Thanks. So as before, Language Nut, we've come up with a few activities for this as well. So we have lots of vocabulary and chunk retrieval games, including the voice recognition software for the speaking. We also have a bunch of sentence building games, and we're still working on some more. And again, with everything, we do it so that you can track everything that the students are doing. So you can see the scores, you can see kind of diagnostics of which ones they're struggling with, and so on. So there are things that you can do in the classroom, there are things that you can do online as well. And yeah, if I could go on to the next slide, please. Thanks very much. And then this is the third section. So the bit that we're all really aiming for, this is the open speaking. So getting beyond the fluency from just small, very rehearsed pieces to then actually producing it and increasing the fluency. And you have to go through all those stages in order to get here. You can't just start it, as you know. So what can we do? Because again, I can see from the survey loads and loads of challenges that people are facing, and one of them is that you can't walk around the classroom as we used to do, where the students are all doing pair work. You can't walk around and listen to them, so it's the only people you can really hear is the front row, which is difficult when you want to give feedback, especially if you need to provide evidence, or you need to grade your students on their overall speaking. It's really difficult to be able to do that. And the other thing, which again we all used to do, was getting one student at a time to come up to your desk while the others are getting on with something and doing a one-to-one with them, or even the dreaded oral exam where you'd be stuck in some tiny little meeting room or a broom cupboard somewhere and doing that. It's really difficult to do that now with social distancing. So we have to find new ways. This is one where I think we probably have to be the most creative in finding solutions. So one thing we can do is to make more use of peer assessment. And for this, it needs to be really, really structured. So you need grids. You can have, so I've got an example here where you've got different structures. You can even give examples of those structures according to the topic that you're using. Or you could give specific questions that they can ask. So making it really, really structured so that the students can assess each other. Obviously, it means that you don't get to hear it directly, but it does mean that it becomes a listening exercise as well as a speaking exercise. So it does actually mean it's good for both students. So that's one thing you can do. You can use, if you're doing remote teaching, you can use breakout rooms. So most video call software, Zoom and Teams and so on, allows you to do breakout rooms. So if students are in one room, you can take one or a small group, you can pull them into another breakout room and do a quick assessment there, which is obviously completely socially distanced. And then the other thing that you can do, which is again something I used to do when I was teaching even before COVID, was getting students to record their responses. So either in class, they can do it on their on phones if they're allowed, or we used to have dictaphones, or you can set it as homework. So what I used to do was email them a question or put something on the homework system. Say, here's a question, here's a photo or something, record your response to it, and then send it back to me. But and that is great. There are a few things you need to be aware of with that. One of them is that can be a bit of a nightmare when it comes to organisation. So you have suddenly 30 emails coming back, with MP3s and mixed in with all your other emails, making sure you have everything, you haven't lost it, or students not quite sure what software they should use to record it. So you get some ridiculous file that no man has ever seen before because they've recorded it on some strange phone or tablet. The other problem is it's not very easy to do spontaneous speech that way. So naturally, I would say, look at the question and then just answer it. Just tell me what comes into your head. Don't look on Google Translate. But of course, what do? Teenagers are teenagers all over the world, and that is what they do. So they would go into Google Translate, they'd type it out, they'd read it, and suddenly I'd have loads of year 7s using fü in French or ging in German, much more complex structures. So that can be an issue. It depends on your class. The other issue is there are obviously lots and lots of websites where you can do this, and they can be absolutely great. So there's lots of you may be using Flipgrid or Seesaw or Vocaroo, lots of those ones like that. But just be aware of any safeguarding policies. So just check, you might need to get parental permission depending on how the storage works on those sites. And with things like Flipgrid, for example, whether your class is ready to see each other's, or if they're the kind of class that, because often it works that the students can see everyone's responses in the class, which can be absolutely great for kind of peer assessment, but it really depends on your students, them. It's a lot of difference between a very keen year 7 class and a slightly tough year 9 class, for example. So just be aware of those things. But that can be something that you can do. You can use recordings, and often students are more comfortable speaking to a phone. If they're recording videos of themselves on TikTok all the time, then they're probably happier talking to a phone than they are talking to you, or talking up in class. So that can be really helpful, and it means that you can actually dedicate a lot more time to that one-to-one, really listening to what that student is. And of course, storing it means that if you need to keep any evidence, if you're giving a kind of grade, depending on the system where you are, if you need to give a grade, an overall grade of their speaking progress throughout the year instead of an exam, that's something you can do. If I could have the next slide, please, Jim, that'd be great. Thank you. So we've obviously tried to solve this problem as well with Language Nut, and this is probably the feature that I'm proudest of, because it was such a real pain for me when I was teaching, trying to do this. So what we've done is we have open speaking exercises with both. We have a load of questions in target language or in English. We have a load of photo stimuli as well, covering all kinds of different topics, and you can assign these to your students. And the way it works for the student is when they log in, they enable their microphone, they get all set up, and then when they press start, they see the photo or the question or whatever it is, and the timer starts. You'll see in the picture on the left, it says recording will begin in 57 seconds. So they have 1 minute, and the microphone will begin to record them after 1 minute. They are aware of this, of course, they've accepted this at the time. And we've calculated that 1 minute is enough time to have a think and start recalling appropriate structures and vocabulary to use. But it's not enough time to go to Google Translate, type in everything you want to say, and then read it. So after a minute, the recording starts. They give their response. So they might describe the people in the photo, or they might answer the question, and then they submit it and you send it to the teacher. Then on the right, you can see the teacher screen. In one place, you get all the classes recordings. So you can just literally just go down through the people, play, listen, give a mark, and then submit, go to the next one. You can do the whole lot as quickly as possible. We all remember how long it took us marking speaking or trying to do that in our teaching days. So That's why we try to make it as quick as possible. You can add a grade, or you can also add feedback, so written feedback, and we've also just added a feature for verbal feedback as well. So if you want to correct pronunciation, lots of you are French teachers, so you know you've all had the dreaded parce que, and you can say no, it's not parce que, it's parce que, practicing the r sound or whatever difficult sounds that they're having, or strange pronunciations they've managed to come up with. You can do that. So that's something we've tried to do to solve that problem as much as possible. Okay, and just quickly before the end, I just want to give you some updates on the survey. So you can see that the biggest problems that people are facing are there are lots of schools where they're doing all the lessons through remote learning, and there are also equally lots of schools who are doing a mix at the same time. Lots of schools who are wearing masks in the classroom, so obviously I know that does depend, and not being allowed to do one-to-one speaking assessments is a big thing as well. So hopefully some of the things that I've suggested today might be useful to you for helping with those, but thank you very much for submitting your answers in the survey, and if you want to add any more as well, that would be great later on if you haven't yet done so. If I could just go on to the last slide, please, Jim. Thanks. So to sum up, really, I've tried to give you some useful and some practical tips, and in every webinar that I ever give, I always want to do the Monday morning test, which is that there should be, hopefully, if I've done my job correctly, there should be something practical and tangible that you can do with your class, you know, next week. So we really love it if in the chat or in the Q&A, if you could write down one thing that you remember that you think, yeah, I can do that with my class, because we don't want this just to be theoretical or a load of, you know, me waffling on about some ideas. It's what can you actually do. You have given up your time, and we want to give you something real to use. So if anybody is interested in using LanguageNet, you're more than welcome to contact us. We can give you a month's free trial. My colleague Lucas is our specialist for the Middle East. He's just moved back from Dubai, so he knows the area really, the region very, very well. Or you're more than welcome to contact me, and if you've got any questions or anything like that. But also hopefully some of the other things that I've given you, there's absolutely no pressure whatsoever to use LanguageNet. Hopefully there are other tips as well that you can use. So thanks very much. Really looking forward to hearing any questions that you might have, and over to you, Claire.
Okay, Zoe, thank you so much for for your expertise today. It's excellent to hear from you. Thank you. So we'll come back to you later with any questions at the end of the webinar. So for our second contribution today, we have Louise Nolan, who is speaking on behalf of Nord Anglia International School in Dubai, and she will focus on the research into target language usage and how we can develop and maximise the use of target language in lessons. She'll also discuss the benefits and the challenges of using the target language in our practice. Louise is the head of World Languages faculty at NAS Dubai, leading the French, Spanish, Mandarin, German and Arabic teams. She is a Spanish teacher with previous experience based in the UK and in Spain, where she also taught English as a foreign language. She holds a master's degree in international education from King's College London. Okay, Louise, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Zoe for her insights and encouragement for teachers navigating their way through this pandemic, and Claire for your introduction. We are one of the lucky ones by the sounds of things, because here at NAS Dubai we are in the building physically, albeit teaching world languages with a bit of a twist. As Claire mentioned, my name is Louise, and I relocated to Dubai 6 years ago, which is when I joined NAS Dubai as a Spanish teacher, and where I have been the head of world languages for the last 3 years. So our students begin their language journey in nursery, which continues through to the diploma program in 6th form, and we offer both advanced language programs and second language programs. I'm very pleased to join you here today to share with you some of my experiences in relation to target language in the foreign language classroom. Hopefully you find the presentation insightful, and that we can find more opportunities to collaborate and share good practices in the future. I will add at this point that I'm really thankful to Zoe for her insights on how to approach target language during COVID and the restrictions that we are feeling. because my presentation is a little bit more based on when normality resumes, what we can do. So the link on the slide that has also been shared in the chat function should redirect you to a Padlet wall, where I would ask that you share any experiences that you have using target languages, including tips or any questions as well. So I think it is fair to say that there's a level of uncertainty with regards to target language and language one use. I've worked in schools in the past where the policy was that target language is the only language that should be spoken throughout a lesson. And in fact, many leaders who I've worked with have had the conception that this is the best way to teach languages. Whilst I strongly believe that immersion is the most effective way and the most effective learning strategy, I would also argue that effective use of language one in language lessons will support target language learning and will increase understanding and productivity within a lesson. I remember teaching, well, my first teaching role as a 22-year-old in Spain. I taught English as an additional language in a small mining town in Asturias. The owner there had a strict policy that I could only speak English within the classroom, and I found that it actually really frustrated me. Many times I thought to myself it would just be so much quicker if I could simply use a little bit of Spanish in a blended or balanced approach. Over time, I started to gradually adapt my practice and speak Spanish anyway, at times when I thought it was necessary. And I found this to be more effective, and I could see firsthand the impact because my husband was teaching in the classroom next door. He couldn't speak Spanish, was only using the target language, and I noticed a difference between the level of language within both classrooms. I guess this is the first time I really started to think about target language versus language one, and I began to reflect a lot on my practice so I could judge when using language one resulted in a lost opportunity for students and when it actually supported them. Next slide, please, Jim. So in terms of what the research is saying, for language to stick in students' minds, they need to hear as much of it as possible. How they hear that target language or language two is open to discussion. Indeed, given how uncertain the research is in the field, a common approach should be taken to cater for all needs and which continue to expose students to large amounts of comprehensible language too. Students can only activate words and grammar if they're hearing them multiple times in the classroom. There's a quote on the slide at the moment from prize-winning British linguist Rod Ellis, and he summarises by saying that the opportunity to interact in the target language is central to developing second language proficiency. Conversely, in a briefing paper circulated for the House of Commons by Robert Long, Shadi Dinechi and Philip Loft in January 2020, outlined that in many of the secondary schools visited by Ofsted across England, opportunities for students to listen to and communicate in the target language were often limited by many teachers' unpreparedness to use it. So that brings me back to the question, what can we do in our classrooms and within department policy to ensure that opportunities are not missed for students to listen to and engage in their use of target language? Next slide, please. So in terms of spontaneous talk and increasing it and classroom interactions and the role that they play within the classroom setting, if we think that or visualize any language classrooms that we've been in today or in the past with all of the displays and whatnot all around, and we think about students reading from those displays or students asking for a pencil or can I go to the toilet? These are all great situations and great examples of students exploring target language, but classroom interactions through the process of presentation and practice of language material is much more desirable in terms of practicing target language. And interactions can be between the teacher and the student or between students themselves. As teachers, we should plan our questioning techniques to include a repertoire ranging from closed-end questions to open-ended questions. And in curriculum planning, question ourselves, is there enough coverage of reading and storytelling so that students can listen to authentic language? When completing oral work, I ask myself, is the focus on fluency or on accuracy? And I do share this with students. Fluency tasks focusing on meaning. They can range from information gap tasks, task-oriented discussion, dialogues, guessing games, or general open-ended discussion. And in these tasks, I won't correct the language. My role is as listener rather than corrector. On the other hand, accuracy activities, including questions to answers, perhaps practicing a grammar point that has previously been presented, drilling, completing paired work tasks with focus on grammar, for example, battleships or paired dictation. In these situations, my role as teacher, I will correct any mistakes because the focus in this instance is on form. So how do we get students to develop the ability to talk on their own in language 2, producing those original utterances without written prompts? As teachers, we have to motivate, maximize input and practice. For spontaneous talk to be developed effectively, a top tip according to much research is to get students to do pair or group oral interaction through tasks requiring negotiation of meaning. For example, information gap tasks. According to this view, the most important part of the oral skill acquisition occurs when students are practicing putting a message across to another speaker, regardless of the mistakes they make. And with practice, students can develop spontaneous speech. In planning, thinking about what activities are input, for example, reading and listening, and which are output, speaking and writing, will really help students to develop their spontaneous speech. Listening will model speaking, reading, modeling writing. So to link this to developing target language, how can target language songs, for example, or authentic stories be used to maximize speaking output? Next slide, please. So in order to avoid code switching from language 2 to language 1, which can promote lazy behavior as students grow accustomed to waiting for the translation, there are various things that we can do as teachers to try and support. So as on the slide that you can see, using gestures, pictures and visuals, giving definitions, drawing upon knowledge of cognates, contextualizing vocabulary, paraphrasing with synonyms and antonyms, and simply planning when to use that target language so that chunks are manageable and students can maintain focus. Underpinning all of this, and perhaps where some confusion lies with teachers, is that teachers should exercise and feel confident to do so their own judgment of when to revert to that language 1. If teachers think they should offer an explanation in a common language, then they should do so without guilt or without fear. The classrooms where I have noted most successful use of target language are those where pair or group work are exploited to the full potential. And use of cooperative learning structures like quiz trade and rally coach tend to lend themselves to increased target language spoken in the classroom environment and in an active learning way. In terms of evaluating what to use when between teacher-led work or pair work or group work, pair work is often preferable to some based on the fact that students have more opportunities to speak. There is also a tendency for students to remain more focused on the task. Conversely, beginners are likely to respond more to teacher-led work. Modeling the activity briefly is useful, and establishing habits as well as setting the bar high with your expectations for pair work or group work is imperative to its success. Students should be well rehearsed in that significant language 1 is unacceptable, and remember as teachers that productive noise is good noise. Successfully managing the classroom for myself it took time to develop. And I think as teachers, we should also be mindful that there's a lot to also depend on students' natural flair for spoken language. Likewise, students should also be reassured by an empathetic teacher who knows how to stimulate their interests, what amuses them, and what will push them out of their comfort zone. With review and evaluation, teachers and departments should work together to analyse what is working well, where is there room for improvement, and what is the impact in student performance and student enjoyment levels of increased and manageable target language use. Does curriculum build language competencies so students have realistic expectations? If language 2 comes from structured practice and meaningful input, is this visible in medium and long-term department plans? Is there repetition of high-frequency vocabulary and structures across units of work to allow students to recycle their knowledge. For example, are retrieval grids used to their full potential? Next slide, please, Jim. So what are the challenges then of using target language, and what do we do when we're faced with this adversity? So, I mean, we all know schools are busy, curriculum time is never enough, particularly with languages. We're faced with time constraints, and we can all slip into bad habits, becoming relaxed in our target language use and so on. In my experience of this, dropping by a language lesson with a peer and listening to their activities, watching their student engagement levels and enjoying their responses is my remedy, and I find that it kickstarts my focus and drive with immediate effect. Secondly, what to do when you know you are losing that class. Can you resort to translation methods to refocus the student attention? It's more important, I think, to survive that situation and build relationships with students rather than lose the trust of you as teacher in the eyes of the student. Involve students as well in the why behind using target language. Share theory knowledge with them. Ask them to think about how they have learned their mother tongue as infants so that they can draw the links and reflection from this too. I would say try working in bursts of language 2 for specific timeframes if there is a challenge in using target language with particular groups or sets. For example, language 2 for 10 minutes with no language 1 at all. Make it a competition and build upon the amount of time that you can spend speaking in the target language. Students can be easily confused when the language 2 is not used with skill or carefully selected for ranging levels or difficulty. So as teachers, we should be mindful of this and tweak our target language for abilities. Weaker students struggle with the concentration required if the teacher talks too much with few contextual clues. Target language use is not supported by explanation in language 1. I have found that some students struggle to have a feel for what they've even achieved in a lesson. Students may also feel like they are not progressing. They do not notice any improvements in their target language use, and as referenced by Gianfranco Conti, returns after long term rather than short term are true of target language progress. So loop students into that discussion so they feel reassured. Catering for the needs of learning styles in addition to level is also important here, because we need to be mindful of those who thrive on an approach founded strongly on target language. Do they have adequate exposure to listening to the authentic language in the classroom setting, but also catering for those students that prefer to chunk target language so that they can understand and build confidence? Research again indicates that when teaching in the language 2, the most skillful teachers manage to balance these requirements, creating a sympathetic, caring environment where students feel at ease, contributing to classroom interactions, unafraid of making mistakes. So when is it okay then to use language 1 or a common language? So explaining complex activities, it saves time and allows more time for language 2 practice. Giving cultural complex information, I often find that when I share anecdotal stories from time spent in Spanish-speaking countries, I revert to English in those situations, because I find that it draws students in more when they can fully visualize and understand what the story being shared really is. Not an issue here, thankfully, but back in the UK, I did find when I had to use stronger, perhaps, or more robust behavior management techniques, that I would do that in English rather than in the target language. And I really don't think that any teacher should feel guilty for that or feel fear of reverting to the common language in a situation like that. Likewise, I also find that particularly with lower classes, lower sets and beginners, I will share the goals of lessons in English so that students can really have a psychological connection, let's say, to what they need to achieve within the time frame of the lesson. And on that same note, when giving feedback, I tend to write my feedback with longer comments in English, so short emotive feedback, good work, well done, yes, in Spanish or in the target language, but for further, more responsive feedback, I do use English. So, next slide, please. The desired impact and outcome of this very brief presentation is just really to encourage some reflection on how you are using the target language in your classrooms and what are the key principles you and the rest of your teams, colleagues and teams adhere to. What is your faculty vision for target language use? Have you started to nudge into that zone of perhaps teaching to a test instead of facilitating confidence and fluency? And working in an international setting, perhaps in a school that has got the 3 phases from EYFS to primary and finally secondary, what does target language look like across those phases? So please do feel free to share any of your experiences or pose any questions to the Padlet link which was shared earlier, or get in touch directly to the information which is shared on the screen at the moment. And I really do recommend the work of Gianfranco Conti. A lot of what I've shared with you today has been taken from the book on screen, The Language Teacher Toolkit, which I do believe to be a really useful and valuable read for any language teacher working through the pandemic and through language life at any time. So thanks once again, and please do post any of your thoughts to the Padlet. Thank you, Claire.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise, for your contribution. I can see that we have no live questions at the moment, but if there is anybody watching the recording, then please do feel free to post some questions into the BSME forum pages. So thank you so much, everyone. Please remember to share this webinar with your colleagues at school. The recorded version will be available early next week on the MFL network page. As BSME members, you are also eligible to watch the webinars in any of the networks, including Teaching and Learning, Leadership Matters, and Safeguarding. If you have any questions at all about the webinar later, please, of course, ask them in the Q&A discussion forum on the network page for MFL. In fact, please do engage with us on the discussion forums, as this is our tool to use to support each other. If you do have any network-specific resources, of course, that you would like to share, please load them into the resources sharing forum. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, 21st of January, on the theme of cognitive processes in language acquisition. And it just remains for me to give a final thank you to our speakers, Zoe and to Louise, and to our listeners today for attending. And I do hope you will join us again for our next webinar. Thank you so much.